and welcome to the second edition of the boOkmArks series, Open Conversations about Open Access Books, organized by the Open Access Books Network. It's a lot of open access there. I'd like to mention that this session will be recorded, and in case you'd prefer not to be recorded, please feel free to turn off your video and write us if you have any further concerns. As part of this series, everyone is more than welcome to ask or write down their questions, which will be addressed during the second part of this hour. For the second edition, we will be talking about a new white paper published in September by Springer Nature and the Collaborative Open Access Research and Development Team, also known as CORD. At least I believe that's how it's pronounced. The white paper is titled Diversifying Readership Through Open Access, a Usage Analysis for Open Access Books. And it presents the analysis of usage data for nearly 4,000 books, including 281 open access books, exploring what effect, if any, publishing open access has on the geographic usage of books. Today we are joined by Ross Pyne, Director of Open Access Books and Book Policies at Springer Nature, and Cameron Neylon, Professor of Research Communications at Curtin University and researcher at CORD. Ross, Cameron, thank you for joining us today for this live session and for conducting this research, really. Before I kick off with some of the questions we had here, would you mind sharing a brief introduction of this project and some of its key findings, perhaps?
Sure. So, as you said, we provided CORD with a data set of almost 4,000 books, and 281 of those were OA books. And the thing that we were most interested to find out about was the effect that OA has on the geographic usage of open access books. And at the same time as we were doing this, we took the opportunity to rerun some of the work that we had done sort of as Springer Nature 3 years before, but with a sort of more rigorous methodology, looking just at the sort of basic comparison of OA versus non-OA books in terms of downloads and citations. So the key findings then were that OA does have a robust effect on the number of downloads, the geographical diversity of downloads, and the number of citations of books. So downloads of books, of OA books in the study, were 10 times those of the non-OA books on average, and citations were 2.4 times higher on average for OA books. And Cameron team looked at this across samples of different subjects, so breaking books down into humanities, social sciences, business and econ, biomedical sciences, and physical sciences and computer science. And so we see that OA advantage for every category of book in the sample. So a minimum of 2.7-fold increase in downloads for OA books. And we also saw it across all 3 years of publication that we had in the data set, and for all types of books. So we included monographs and edited collections and mid-length books, so Springer Briefs and Palgrave Pivots in the study. Then in terms of the geographical effects, OA books had a greater proportion of usage in a wider range of countries. So they were downloaded in 61% more countries, so they're definitely reaching some regions that the non-OA ebooks aren't reaching. The OA books had higher usage in low-income and lower-middle-income countries, including a high number of countries in Africa. And the team also did analysis using the Gini coefficient disparity index and showed that OA books had quantitatively greater geographic diversity of downloads. They looked at downloads of OA books from the open web versus those from kind of institutional network points. So were these places that Springer Nature has an existing relationship with, of course, and found that downloads of OA books from the open web would generally double those from the institutional network points. And of course, we can't rule out that some of that is, off-campus access from readers who might also have institutional access. But there's also some really interesting effects in terms of the countries where you see those sort of increased downloads from the open web. So really a substantial difference that OA is making to the reach of books. And alongside that, we looked at the effect of title on the number of downloads, finding that books that contained the names of countries and regions in their title generally showed enhanced usage, particularly in those regions, with the effect most apparent in Latin America and Africa, and with a much stronger effect for OA books. So OA is not only enhancing usage in countries that are underrepresented in global scholarship, but it's also enhancing the global usage of scholarship about those countries. So that's the sort of highlights. There's lots more in the white paper and in the preprint. Cameron, I don't know if you want to add anything that I've missed from those highlights.
No, I think you covered most of the findings. I think what was exciting about it was really this notion that there is seems to be a greater reach, that there's an effect where this content is getting to more places. There's clearly lots more to be done around what the drivers of that are. We can't tell a huge amount about what the causes behind that are. But that fact that you do see an effect of open access on the title effect was really interesting to us. And that seems to be a sort of concentration effect there, which I think is quite exciting in terms of it looking at sort of second order effects beyond just saying, you know, closed access gets less views or open access gets more.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, then I will jump into some of the questions we had for you. But first, again, would like to state we're very pleased to. Oh, I see we have some music here. Thanks for muting again. Yeah, no, just to say that we are very pleased to see this research being out there, as there is, of course, limited research on the effect of open access for books. So the more research there is certainly welcome to help us understand the effects. So to start with the first question, as you say, your paper is the largest independent analysis of usage of open access and non-open access books ever conducted over the longest periods of time. That must have been quite an endeavor to undertake. What were your ambitions when working on it? What were you hoping to achieve, and what worked, didn't work, and why did it work or not work?
So I think from Springer Nature's perspective, this at root came from a desire to support the expansion of OA for books. So wanting to encourage more authors to choose that option, wanting to encourage more funders to back it, so that authors are able to make that choice. I mean, to put it another way, we don't want books to get left behind in the move to OA. And I think being able to point to evidence for the benefits of OA can be really powerful in helping to change attitudes. I guess there's a question about why readership and why the geography of readership specifically. And I mean, to be honest, this was partly just that when we did the earlier work, the first question everyone asked us was, well, where are these extra readers coming from? And we didn't have a good answer to it, and we were really interested. But we also knew that when we did a survey last year, so we went out to many book authors, we worked with the community to send it out far beyond Springer Nature authors to ask what they thought of OA for books. And we learned, you know, a key motivator when you're publishing a book is to get a broad audience, to get beyond a pure academic audience, and also for authors who were publishing OA books in particular to reach authors, readers who were in low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, that diversity of readership. So it seemed like a key question that could help persuade people. And we know it's also a topic that's of interest to funders. And I guess some people have said to us, but isn't it obvious? Of course OA would increase readership. I mean, what's the point of doing this? And yet it does seem intuitively the case that it would increase readership, but I think it's really important to do the research to back up those intuitions. And I think also by doing that research, you can quantify some of those benefits, you know, not just downloads, but 10 times more downloads, and not just more countries, but 61% more. Maybe we don't want to get too hung up on the numbers, but it gives you a sense of the scale. I guess also from our perspective, we really wanted to make sure that it was methodologically rigorous, that it wouldn't just be seen as a kind of Springer Nature puff piece, but was something that was genuinely useful to the community. And that's why it was so important to us to work with an academic team. And I really couldn't have thought of anyone I would have rather worked with in terms of their expertise in this area. Yeah, Cord were great partners for the project, and we're so pleased that they wanted to take it on. Yeah. Over to Cameron.
I mean, from our side, there was, I mean, obviously we're concerned. Lucy and I and many of the rest have been concerned about making the case that open access does achieve something. I mean, there are certainly, the wanting to make that case more strongly and more effectively. And this was really an opportunity to work with a data set at a scale and with an internal consistency that's really hard to come by. It's a real opportunity to be able to compare like with like. We'll talk a little bit about sampling later, I guess. But to compare a sample size of OA books of this size with a very large set of non-open access books that are available through the same platform and through the same mechanisms and have the same kinds of processes going on behind them in terms of promotion and metadata and delivery and dissemination. That was an incredibly powerful opportunity to be able to really dig into what's going on at a large scale. And that was really exciting.
Okay, and if we look at some of the titles, so the titles that you've analyzed were divided into 3 book types: monographs, contributed volumes, and briefs, as well as 5 discipline clusters: the humanities, social sciences, business and economics, medical, biomedical, and life sciences, and finally physical sciences, engineering, mathematics, and computer science. From there on, you undertook a matching process between open access and non-open access books in a similar group. Could you explain that particular process and the reason and the statistical strengths and weaknesses of the approach, and whether this is an approach others should follow?
Yes, I guess, I mean, the first thing to be really clear about is this isn't a randomized control trial, which if you wanted to show an absolutely causal effect between an intervention like open access and readership, you'd need a randomized control trial or a different kind of experiment than the one that we were able to do. This is a retrospective analysis of a cohort. Now, a traditional way to do this would probably have been to take a big sample set, and maybe even a bigger sample set than we did, code up a set of explanatory variables and ask how much those variables, like year of publication, discipline cluster, the book type, explained an effect on usage or citations or web visibility. We didn't want to take that approach for a variety of reasons. I mean, you will have, those of you who spent a lot of time in statistics will know that there's issues in terms of p-hacking, and those of you who don't have probably heard of p-hacking, this ability to go and retrospectively look down into these categories and look for the cases where you see an effect. So we wanted to do something different, and we wanted to do something that was statistically consistent in terms of a comparison sample across the set. So we took a fairly small set of variables, the publication year, the discipline cluster, and the book type. And then we looked at all of the open access books that Springer Nature had in English, so we restricted ourselves to one language, across those 3 years of publication. And then we looked at the full set of open access books, of which there are many thousands, and asked the question, what was the maximum sample we could build that had the same number of comparisons, same number of non-OA to OA books in every category. And so then we have a consistent statistical comparison in each of those categories. And then having constructed that data set, we could then go and ask whether we saw a difference, both across the whole set and within the categories. So this is sort of the reverse of the p-hacking problem, in the sense that we saw an effect, and we expected to see an effect. We expected to see an increase in usage and visibility and citations. But did we see that consistently across all the categories? So going down into those categories, did we still see that effect? And was it robust to various other concerns you might have? And there's a little bit of a risk here. So this approach is good if you're expecting a strong effect. And we were expecting, you know, a reasonably strong effect, but what we didn't really expect was, as we dug into these categories, that for every discipline, for every type of book, for every year of publication, for every month after publication, that in every single one of the categories we looked at, we always saw a really quite substantial increase in usage. Now, we don't have that time domain information for the web visibility or the citation data. We can talk about that. But we were really looking for this confirmatory evidence and to build a case for that. And I think this is a potentially quite powerful way where you've got a strong effect, we're expecting a strong effect. Where you wouldn't want to use an approach like this is if you're looking for the real subtleties of the details of what was going on under the hood. For that, you need to really get into that kind of more conventional statistical approach where you'd look for the power of various variables to explain the differences. So you won't see us talk about p-values or t-tests or anything like that. What we're doing is saying, you know, everywhere you look, there's always an increase across all the categories.
Then if we take a closer look at the analysis, there are three main metrics that you've used: the number of downloads, the number of citations, and web visibility. Could you comment on why these particular proxies have been chosen, and if you considered looking at other aspects of usage as well?
I mean, to some extent, you have to sort of make the scope manageable. It had to be a doable project, and downloads and citations do tend to be the areas that authors and funders are most interested in. I absolutely don't mean that to indicate that we should measure impact through citations, and we might come on to that a little bit later, but it is something which tends to be kind of key topics of interest. And maybe it's also worth noting that others are doing great work in the altmetric area, so Mike Taylor's recent report in that area. So there's a sort of broad range of research being done, and we don't need to do all of it in this one report.
Yeah, I think it's the things we
I keep unmuting this participant. If we could ask you to make sure that you mute yourself. I mean, it's great to have some music, but maybe for later, we can save it for the last part. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's, it could have been interesting certainly to look at social media, but that's really, really challenging. We know that the patterns with which authors are engaging with social media for books is a little different, often not linking back to web addresses, so they can be difficult to find. Home, British soldiers. Have you got no fucking home?
Okay, I would like to ask again people to make sure that they are muted. If you keep on putting music and acting naughty, I will be forced to remove you from this meeting. Just a warning. So please, let's continue.
Yes, I think we did want to focus on things where we were. So we have at least 13 randomized non-OA books across the sample for every OA book that we're looking at. So we're comparing a distribution of lengths to each, and the way in which those distributions are at least moderately randomized, and then we also took a look at that effect directly. So we looked at the effect of the change in downloads as a function of the length of the book. And we started doing that for a variety of reasons to see whether we could see evidence of non-academic use. But it also shows that the change in downloads is robust over the set of books and over the different lengths. You see that both for page count and for chapter count. So, you know, in an ideal world, we'd be digging into those two kinds of downloads separately. But without that, we can at least show that the effect is robust over the set of lengths we have and over the distributions. Are they both log normal? That's a good, it's actually a log normal. I guess we'll come back to that. log normal over which variable?
Yeah, sorry, there was a question from the chat, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we will get to that question in a bit, if you don't mind. Then, while sticking on the topic of usage, there appears to be a greater usage of open access books in science subjects and also in business and economics. Why do you think that might be, particularly since the book is more significant for research in the humanities and social sciences?
So this gets into questions that we actually can't really answer directly with the data we have in this study. So there's either a difference in the audience size or there's a difference in the usage patterns for those different disciplinary groupings. There's some tantalizing notions in the data that there are different kinds of usage appearing for different disciplines or different groups. Sometimes for some of those categories, we see usage slow down over time. For some of them, it's remarkably flat. In a couple of cases, it actually seems to be going up. There are also differences in the differences between the OA and the non-OA between those in those different categories. What we can't do is ascribe that to difference in audience size. So we might argue that there are more people in general. There's big audiences for books in the sciences than there are in the humanities. Or indeed, it might be that people who are reading humanities books tend to go there once and download it, but people in the sciences, particularly thinking about edited volumes, where a lot of those books in the sciences are likely to be sort of methods guides and techniques. You can certainly imagine that a person might be downloading that every time they go back into the lab. I guess in principle, you could think about doing deeper analysis by that, looking really deeply into the IP addresses that the requests are coming from, but that's really quite complicated. And it raises privacy issues as well. So I think there's some really interesting things to look further into. There's some tantalizing hints that there are signals that could be related to different kinds of usage, different kinds of users. But we can't say a lot about that with the analysis we've done to this point, certainly.
And when talking about this white paper and the analysis, yeah, have you considered making the data behind it openly available?
Yeah, so we did release the webometrics and the citation data for all the books in the study. That was actually public data. And so that's available along with the code, and it's attached to the technical paper that's on Zenodo. So the part that we didn't release was the usage data, except for one example for an OA book. Ultimately, Springer Nature is a commercial organization, and the usage data for the non-open access books is pretty commercially sensitive. So, I mean, you can actually look, if you go to our platform, you can see that data for individual books, OA and non-OA, but to kind of release it as a data set was something we couldn't do. Acknowledge that's a limitation, but it would be a shame not to do this sort of research just because we can't release the data. I guess I would say we've actively looked for opportunities to collaborate with researchers and with the OA Books communities so that research can be done based on our data. That's something that we're keen to continue, and I would certainly encourage anyone who is interested in working on that sort of collaborative data project to get in touch. And we're also, certainly from the OA Books point of view, interested in sharing for the benefit of the community where that's possible. And I think it's about realistically creating safe spaces for commercial organizations to be able to share their data. That's difficult. I think the OA ebook usage data trust project is going to be really important. We're participating in that. It comes with the promise that participants' data might become available in an aggregated and anonymized form, but would still become part of a larger corpus on which further study could be done.
Yeah, and there's an important point here, I think, around transparency in general and quality of reporting. We went into this working with Springer Nature knowing that there were going to be sensitivities about some of the data, and we talked about data sharing really early on and tried to make the process by which we did the analysis as reproducible as we could. I wouldn't say we did a perfect job on that, but I think we've done a reasonably good job in terms of providing cryptographic hashes of the raw data, ways of verifying if I were to run an analysis for you on the data set, I could cryptographically confirm that I was actually doing it on the same data set. And then providing some more of that kind of ability and the code that actually does the analysis. This is something that's really worth, I think, thinking about quite hard. There are always going to be data sets and data sources which are sensitive in one sense or another. We are, as I think I mentioned before, sort of starting to impinge on issues that do get towards GDPR and privacy. So there's some parts of this data that can't be shared and should not be shared. Certainly we shouldn't be inadvertently releasing information about who is reading which books. That would actually be fairly unethical. So thinking about ways in which we can validate what we've done and that people can have confidence that what we say we've done is what we did do, I think is really important. And yeah, we'd really welcome feedback on ways in which we can improve that. Again, yeah, Eric's point, the raw data shown in the plots, I think we didn't think of that until relatively late in the process, and it was difficult to drop out the data without leaking out the details of the individual book data, just because of the way we've done the analysis. But I don't think it would be impossible to share some of the sort of numbers that underpin the plots themselves. You can always data thief them, of course. They're probably there in the PDF if you want to go down that far.
Okay, thank you. I see we're at the halfway point. I still have a few more questions, but I see there are also some questions in the chat. But I will just continue with. Well, I will pick one or two questions, and I think then we move to the chat, so everyone else also has a chance to get involved. So this question actually still touches upon the usage as well, and also a bit upon what you mentioned before, Ross. And it's about the inclusion of usage from third-party platforms. So could the inclusion of usage from third-party platforms and aggregators for open access and non-open access books help with getting a better picture of how digital books are being used beyond the Springer Link platform? And what makes it so challenging to do so at this moment? And can any insights be shared as to how much of the Springer Nature ebook usage, open access and non-open access, comes from outside this particular platform, in this case, the Springer Link platform?
Yeah, so I would love to know the answers to some of these questions, because obviously this is the crucial thing about OA, right? That the books can be shared and hosted from any other site. And certainly I wouldn't want anyone to think that because this particular analysis was done on books on Springer Link, or usage from Springer Link, that's what we think is most important, because actually we think it's incredibly important that our OA books are shared widely. We do make an effort to push them out to many third-party platforms. We use CC BY as standard. And that's absolutely fundamental to how OA should work. However, it does really complicate the issue here. So many third-party sites don't send us usage data at the moment. I mean, in fact, the nature of CC BY means that we probably don't know most of the third-party sites that are hosting our OA books. We do get some usage from third parties. So we get some from OAPN, for example. It's quite hard to reconcile that usage data. You can go back to the question about kind of the sort of chapter counts versus whole book counts. But I think even beyond that, how usage, what that sort of usage data actually means. So yeah, I don't have any good answers. Again, I'm kind of hoping that the OA ebook data trust might help provide some solutions here in terms of finding ways to kind of aggregate that data in kind of meaningful ways. And I'm hoping that Cameron has the answers to how we're going to fix all of this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so obviously with the work we've done at Cord over the years, we've looked at data from a range of different sources. So there were reports looking at UCL Press and the different sort of data sources there. We've looked at data from JSTOR and others. And this is the real, there's a real challenge with making any sense of doing a like-for-like comparison. And again, one of the real appeals of this data set was in fact the fact that we had data on both open access and non-open access books from the same platform, on the same platform, through the same platform. So there's a lot of work to be done to even start thinking about being able to compare numbers of whatever sorts from whatever pipelines that come from different platforms. I think there's work we can do to think about models of usage that can get us towards making some of that data more comparable and looking at some of the patterns of usage across different platforms. I mean, we certainly know that there is a lot of usage on many of these platforms. And one thing we haven't looked at, though again, it's in the data, in the web visibility data, what we haven't done is looked at to the extent to which that slight increase, which I think we'll also come back to, in the number of web domains referencing the open access books might be due to them actually being hosted on other sites. So there's another set of data there to look a little further into that question of whether in fact there is much evidence of those books spreading the sites on which they're found, as well as being made available through multiple platforms, which is another whole set of work to think about. But again, I think really our hope with the OA ebook data trust for open monograph usage data is really that we will have the opportunity to think about how we might be able to use the usage data from multiple platforms to help us understand, not necessarily to say, 5 is bigger than 6, but to help us understand what the differences in the patterns of usage are across these different platforms and how that tells us about how we most effectively get content into the places where it can be used.
Then thank you for that whole part about usage. Given the time, I'll ask one final question myself, and then I will leave it to the others, who I think also have some questions. And that talks a bit more about a different aspect. As the paper begins actually by quoting from the Budapest Open Access Initiative, that open access aims to share the learning of the rich with the poor and the poor with the rich. And as you also mentioned, you argue for the prioritizing of measures that will support the expansion of open access for books, including introducing policies that require open access for books and increasing financial support to facilitate this. Currently, a Springer Nature book processing charge amounts to approximately £11,000 for a monograph, and seemingly a one-size-fits-all price. How can an expansion of open access for books be realized without excluding communities from low-income countries and low and middle-income countries, this time on the publication side?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really important question, and it's also a really difficult one. So first, I would note that while open access books are really important for us and they're growing, they're still very much a minority of our scholarly book publishing. A really vast majority of our books from authors all around the world are using a traditional publishing model. And so that does mean that any author who wants to publish a book with us can do so, providing their work passes peer review and meets some other publishers who are based in Europe, based in the US, who might have less diverse author bases. It's good that we have a diverse author base, but actually that makes it even more of a challenge from our perspective. And waiving or deeply discounting BPCs does present challenges. Publisher can answer. I think it's something that probably we need to come together. It needs input from funders. It needs input from institutions.
About more about the statistical distributions that I think you, Cameron, wanted to dive into a bit earlier already.
Yes, I guess I'll let Eric. I mean, yeah, broadly, the usage data shows loosely log normal. I think they're, yeah, there's left skew and there's a fat tail, or a long tail, I should say. It's one of the reasons we didn't really want to get into the forward statistics approach and look for, you know, the sort of standard explanatory variable or linear model approach, was because we didn't really want to have to trust the distribution. So we haven't looked in a huge amount of detail at it, but they're, you know, broadly, I think they're broadly log normal. What I haven't done, which I think probably given the question was in the context of the stuff about the chapter download, chapter versus book downloads and the length, I have to say I haven't deconvoluted out the length effect on that, which would be something that would probably be worth doing.
Yeah, I just want to mention, you know, most of you probably know that I did a very similar analysis on data from University of Michigan and from open book publishers. But what we didn't have was sort of the non-OA comparables that you have in this study. So one thing we weren't able to answer is whether sort of the statistical distribution or the character of the data was very different between OA and non-OA. And you can think of reasons why paywalled data would be less viral than OA data, and so you might expect it to be less spiky and less logarithmic and sort of more normally distributed, which is why I asked that question. The other thing that we saw was that the statistics for individual books were very different. So there was one book that sort of popped out because apparently it was being used in course adoption, and so you had usage that cycled with the semester calendar, which was very different from a lot of the other books, which would just have spikes when someone sort of talked about it, and then everyone started looking at it, and then they'd comment about it, and more people would look at it, and then it would die away very quickly.
Yep.
So I think there's the potential in your study to sort of make some assessments about the differences between OA and non-OA that we weren't able to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we started down that road and then I felt a bit. We did a series of things. I didn't think of taking that route, which we should have done. We looked at a range of things. We were really trying to tease out whether we could get some robust evidence, say, of non-academic use. Could we actually tease out something that looked as though it was trending differently in the OA set, and particularly because we also have this distinction between usage that is logged, which is to say occurs through an IP address with which Springer Nature has a relationship, and there's a whole layer of set of complexities there to talk through as well. And usage which is anonymous, which comes from outside those IP ranges. And so we did a lot of looking at trying to figure out how to baseline things and pull them apart. What we didn't do, and would be worth doing, as you say, is to look at the detailed statistical distribution. There are certainly some spikes in time in the usage data. You can see that in a couple of the categories. The biggest example we've seen of that in the past is work with UCL Press and the book How the World Changed Social Media, which was assigned as the first book for a MOOC. And you saw this just unbelievable increase in usage for that book in the 2 weeks. What was interesting in that case is that we also saw that we saw it through one channel of usage, which was the direct link direct to the PDF, not through the page in the repository, which was kind of interesting because you could even get down to the point of realizing that the course instructors had given a very particular kind of link to the students. What was also interesting is because it was a MOOC, they set a different book that was also open access in the 2nd or 3rd week of the course, and that got lots less downloads. So there's lots in there to look at, and certainly one of the things that I think is potentially most interesting about this kind of analysis in the longer term is actually thinking about rather than obsessing about whether there's a 10% or a 20% or a 50% increase in usage, understanding what kinds of interventions make a difference in that usage. So assigning things for courses is one thing. Having them picked up or mentioned, the author writing an op-ed in the New York Times often also leads to a spike in usage. And all of these things are certainly worth digging into more. So yeah, but I think, yeah, actually doing that, sort of taking a close look at the distributions will be really worthwhile.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers your question, Eric. But if you want to jump in at some point again, you can just unmute yourself. Then, yeah, I see there's another question here from Ronald. Whether you would consider doing something similar with German language titles, where the geographical usage will probably be more skewed, but would be interested in the effects of open access.
Yeah, I mean, that would be really interesting. I don't see why not. I mean, the number of books we would have for the sample would be a lot smaller, so I don't know if we would be able to provide this sort of, or if it would be possible to do the same sort of analysis, but we could have a look and have a talk about it if it's something that you're interested in.
There's definitely, so we've certainly seen, I'm trying to remember exactly how this fell out, but you do see sort of pockets of usage. Again, this was a different study, but where the countries of usage correspond to the language of the authors, I think it was. So we certainly see language effects. We talked early on in this project about whether to include some of the German content, but we decided against it because it was another complication, and we were really trying to keep things as simple as possible in terms of the analysis. But language, yeah, remains a sort of a big area that I don't think we certainly haven't done much work on, and there's been, not a huge amount done on it. and what its effects are. So which is kind of important with things like the Helsinki Declaration on and bibliodiversity concerns in general. So I think it's really worth looking into.
Okay, well, I don't see any further questions for now in the chat, but if any come up, or if Ronald wants to ask another question, then feel free to do so. And given the time, then maybe I will throw in a final question there. And also looking ahead a bit. So we've seen a number of publications coming out in recent years from Springer Nature and open access books. Are you planning on publishing more? And if so, which topics are of particular interest to you and which would you like to explore?
Yeah, so we don't have anything in the works. The observant among you will have noticed that as well as this, we also were participants in the toolkit. And so we've basically released 2 enormous projects within 3 weeks of each other, which I really don't recommend. So we haven't really had time to be working on anything else in the meantime. But we're certainly keen to, as I said, continue to learn more about the effect that open access has. I mean, I would say something I'm particularly interested in that we have done some preliminary work on is that understanding of kind of impact that goes beyond the quantitative. So policy impact, you know, what does impact mean to book authors, and does OA help support that? And so it will be, yeah, certainly a more qualitative study, I think, perhaps more, you know, case studies. So that's an area I'd like to follow up on. But I'm, yeah, also very interested to hear if there are things that others in the community feel we should be looking at. And again, since we have this data set, that would be particularly useful to look at from the point of view of that data set.
Yeah, I think there's lots more questions to be answered here. There's lots of potential work to be done, and there's lots of, I mean, the devil is in the details. The being able to really tease apart some of these different effects, what's driving some of these changes, and you know, we haven't talked at all really about the sort of the detailed geographical analysis that, you know, that you can certainly start looking at, you know, not just the country but the more detailed areas, and is that driven by individuals? Is it driven by people, groups, communities? Is it reading groups and courses, or is it well-networked individuals? And then I think that really brings it back to the impact question. What are the pathways by which, you know, the knowledge and the content gets to the places where it makes a difference? That to me is the question that we'd really like to get at ultimately. You know, how do we get knowledge to the right places, from the right places to the right places, and how do we do that effectively in a resource constrained and in some ways locked down and isolated world at the moment?
Yeah, well, I guess at least this white paper didn't result in a lack of new questions.
More research is required.
Yeah, okay. With that, on that note, I think that given the time, we'll call it a day for now. Yeah, thank you very much, Ross, Cameron, and everyone else for attending today. And we will make the recording available shortly.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.